We are here at the Canadian Museum of History speaking with Michael Pearson, the grandson of Lester B. Pearson, and we're marking the 60th anniversary of Mr. Pearson receiving the Nobel Peace Prize.
Well, Andrew, good to see you. My grandfather was actually an academic first, mid-1920s, University of Toronto, and history professor, and enjoyed it. And he was up here in Ottawa in the summer of 1926 to work on a little project, and happened to be sitting beside O.D. Skelton, who was the first Deputy Minister, Under Secretary of State for External Affairs in those days. And Skelton mentioned to him in passing that he was going to be running this competition to get new officers into the department. A very young department in those days, very few people, very few officers. I think less than 10 at that time. Wow. And my grandfather had some interest in it. Didn't immediately strike him as something he wanted to do, but within a couple of years he decided he wanted to do the test to get in, the examination, and by the late 20s he was an officer in the Department of External Affairs. As I said, one of very few. There was late 1920s, there were very few officers. They only had 3 or 4 places abroad: Japan, I think London, of course, Washington, and Paris in those early days were really the only places that they had abroad. So most of the officers were here in Ottawa and in the East Bloc, because in those days the Prime Minister was also the Minister of External Affairs. And he had his office, the Prime Minister's office was in the East Bloc in those days, so the External Affairs office was also there. So my grandfather started, as he said, I think in an attic, little tiny attic office on the top of the East Bloc on Parliament Hill, and was an officer in the department and at headquarters for about 6 or 7 years after he first joined, until he got his first posting in London in 1935.
So over that period then, he, in his 20 years in the Foreign Service, he played a key role some years later in the creation of the United Nations and NATO. Yeah. Can you tell us a bit about how that happened?
Well, you know, my father wrote a book about my grandfather's diplomacy in the 1950s, and one of the things he talks about is how my grandfather happened to be in the right place at the right time. And in fact, that was a sort of metaphor for Canada as a whole in the post-war period. In the war itself, the Second World War, Canada was a very important ally. You know, at the end of the war, was the 4th largest armed forces in the world. We played an important role, and therefore we played an important role in the development of the various international institutions that were developed, particularly the United Nations, that were developed near the end of the war and then started right after the war. My grandfather at the end of the war was our ambassador to Washington, but a year after the end of the war he came back to Ottawa to become what you would call the deputy minister, the undersecretary himself, the job O.D. Skelton had 20 years earlier. And in that role, he was able to be a key player in the early years and work of the United Nations. In 1948, Mackenzie King, the Prime Minister at the time, and Louis Salamon, who was the External Affairs Minister, decided that they would like to have my grandfather in Parliament and to take over as External Affairs Minister, where Salamon at the same time would take over as leader of the party and Prime Minister. So from 1948, he became, as External Affairs Minister, he became much more significantly involved in some of the development or further development of the post-war multilateral institutions, and that's where NATO came in. Because NATO was created in 1949, about a year after my grandfather, a little under a year after my grandfather became minister. But the idea of NATO started before that, and I think it was started as a result of the recognition that United Nations was not going to be the organization able to manage international peace and security issues, particularly in Europe, as a result of the Soviet Union and the position of Stalin and the approach that Stalin was taking to post-war security in Europe, which was very aggressive. So my grandfather and others, obviously he wasn't alone in that, but Canada was one of very few countries, the United States, England, others, who realized that it was very important to have a security organization, military security organization, that would be transatlantic in nature, would be United States and Canada on the one side, and many of the European countries on the other, Western European countries. On the other hand, not Germany yet at the founding, but they came later. And it was really to try to deal with the problem of the Soviets and the challenge that they were facing of the military power of the Soviets in Eastern Europe at that time. And so NATO was not my grandfather's preferred option. In fact, he often said that if NATO did its job, it shouldn't have to exist for more than 20 years. Of course, many 70 years or so later, we still have it. But it was not intentional at first to have it. He just realized that you need to have this balance, a counterbalance between what the UN was trying to do in the Security Council and where that became a problem, then to have this other military alliance that would ensure that the Russians did not think that this somehow could take over Europe in a way that they could have done with their conventional military superiority at the time. But he also made sure that NATO was not simply a military alliance. I mean, in many ways it is predominantly a military alliance, but the Article 2, famous Article 2, the Canadian article, was inserted at the insistence of the Canadians. My grandfather is the minister involved in that, to try to ensure that NATO would also be involved in other matters. Or the members of NATO would try to focus on political coordination and cooperation and potentially even economic cooperation. The economic cooperation side did not continue, but did not really evolve, I should say. The European Union actually eventually evolved and so on. But the political consultation side, the commitment to political consultation by NATO members, particularly the United States, before making decisions of a military nature that might be of significant interest to other players, was something that Article 2 ended up being an important sort of starting point or an element that led to that process of political consultation, which then got tested with issues like Suez.
Yeah. So with the United Nations and NATO, multilateralism was a major objective of his. Why did he see that as so important?
Well, multilateralism wasn't a new thing. The League of Nations, of course, existed or did exist for 20 years or so after the First World War. I think my grandfather's main motive, though, in support of multilateralism was the experience that he had as a soldier in the First World War, and that experience he had as a civilian on the front lines, literally, in the Second World War. He was in London for the first 2 years of the war. He was in London during the Blitz of 1940, 1941, where thousands and thousands of Londoners were killed. He saw daily, as a civilian, as a diplomat in London, the death and destruction that can happen when countries can't find a way to negotiate peace. And that motivation to prevent war, again, was one of the key ones that pushed him towards trying to find a successor to the League of Nations and work with others to find a successor to the League of Nations that, unlike the League, would actually be able to deter aggression, hopefully, and be able to maintain, support the maintenance of international peace and security from a multilateral base. That was a key issue for him, or a key motivator for him. The other one was the advent of the atomic age. I think he recognized, as many did, that the world could not survive a third world war because if it was fought with atomic weapons, based on the experience that everyone saw with Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Not just the thousands of Londoners, civilians who died in the London bombing and the Blitz, and not just those kind of people would die, but millions more civilians who were not involved in any direct way in conflict. And it was those twin things, the interest in having a multilateral approach to international peace and security, and preventing World War III, preventing a nuclear war, I think were the key factors that sort of encouraged him and acted as his prime motive for all the work that he did at the multilateral level.
Okay, so you mentioned in 1947 he moved from a bureaucratic career to politics. 1948, under Saint Laurent, and became the Secretary of State for External Affairs, what we now call the Minister of Foreign Affairs. And over those next 8 or 10 years, he was involved in various things, including the Suez Crisis, which led to the Nobel Prize. Tell us a bit about that, the Suez Crisis and his role there.
Well, Suez was a unique challenge because it was the first time since the birth of NATO, frankly, the end of the Second World War, the birth of NATO, that NATO allies were not on the same page, significantly not on the same page. Britain and France, on the one hand, had a strong interest in trying to retain control over territory, the Suez Canal, that had been it was a private sector consortium, but it was focused on making sure that the canal would stay open, and all the oil that Britain needed and France needed that came from the Middle East and the Far East came through the Suez Canal. So for them, they had this vital interest in keeping the canal open. The United States did not have that same concern or interest, and more importantly, and this is under President Eisenhower, I think the United States was very much not interested in supporting what they thought was the old colonialism. And indeed, if you look back at the history and the players, Anthony Eden, who was the Prime Minister of London, or of the UK at the time, they were acting a bit like the old colonial powers, even though they were at the same time, those countries, having to give up their empires. France had already had a bloody nose from Indochina, but they were reluctant. They were reluctantly leaving their role as empire. And Suez almost represented the last gasp of empire to try to say, well, we can still control territory, in this case, obviously in Egypt, even though it's not our own. And the United States was saying, no, you can't. And that's what colonial powers do, and we don't agree with that anymore. Canada, I think, my grandfather and others were sympathetic to the American position on that, but that meant that there was a potential split amongst the NATO allies, which could have, this is an organization at that time only 7 years old. People often say in marriage that it's a 7-year itch kind of thing, and in this case in NATO, there were other stresses too, but this was a very significant stress on that alliance. To have such major players, the 3 top players in the alliance, to be against each other in that. So my grandfather's concern was in part the preservation of the alliance. And his second concern was to ensure that the United Nations had a capacity. It was a real test for the United Nations to see whether it had a capacity to deal with a crisis like this in a way not just to bridge the differences between the United States and the UK and France, but also to allow the institution to show that in fact it could make a difference in advancing peace and security. It had done that in some way in Korea 6 years earlier, but that was just a lucky break. The Soviets were boycotting the Security Council for a few months in 1950, and they passed a resolution then in the Security Council that led to the UN Army US-led, but UN Army in Korea. That wasn't going to happen again in a situation like Suez. So they had to get creative. He had to get creative about how to find a solution to the split between the Allies and the split between the colonial and anti-colonial powers. And by the way, also the split between the West and the emerging South, as in the old days of calling it North-South relations, or the South. India in particular, a new player, an important player. Prime Minister Nehru was a very important player. Colonel Nasser, who was the president of Egypt. This was nationalism of a different kind that was exerting itself at that time. And there were a lot of people in England and France who treated Nasser as if he was the latest Hitler. Hitler on the Nile, I think, was the name that they got it. But they totally misunderstood the kind of nationalism that he was expressing that was of interest to the Egyptians and many others emerging out of the old colonial world. And that was, I think, one of the key problems with how the UK and France approached the issue. So that was the backstory. That was the dynamic that led to what happened in New York in late October and November of 1956.
So then he brought the players together and proposed this idea?
Of the UN emergency forces, it was called. What's interesting, I think this is an important thing to understand about my grandfather's role. Let me emphasize 2 things. First, he had been at that time foreign minister, external affairs minister for 8 years. And because of that, and because of his previous experience as a diplomat and his role in London and in Washington and other places, he knew everybody. I mean, he had this amazing list of contacts. His Rolodex was really good in those days, and that was really important because it was relationships. It was the connections that he made. Let me give you one example. Because he was friends with Nehru, he was able to utilize our High Commissioner in India at the time, I think it was Escott Reed at the time, to make sure that Nehru understood where Canada was coming from, what Canada was trying to do. Nehru, and I say that because Nehru had important influence on Nasser in a way that Washington wouldn't have been able to have, certainly the Europeans did not have, not just the French and English, but others. And that influence that Nehru had on Nasser was one of the key things. So this asset that my grandfather had of being well known and well respected and trusted, I think the emphasis on trust is really important, that people did not see him and Canada as having any axe to grind. Even though the fact they were part of the NATO alliance, they were not seen as a country, a player that had any particular interest in trying to support one side or the other. They were trying to figure out a way to solve the crisis. So his experience and his contacts were key. The idea that he promoted of a UN emergency force, the UN police force, was not a new idea. It had just never seen the light of day. There had been talk in the late 1940s when the UN was first created of a UN army. That never happened, but the concept of having UN play some kind of peacekeeping role, or it wasn't called that, but some kind of a police role that would try to try to prevent conflicts or help solve conflicts or bring ceasefires. That wasn't new. What he did, and what was key, was that he advanced the idea. He turned it from an idea that sort of people thought about but couldn't figure out how to make it happen into one that actually could happen in a specific concrete way, which was the creation of an emergency force, multinational in nature, which could be brought in, could ensure that in the context of a resolution where a ceasefire was agreed to, that they would then bring themselves as a multilateral force in to ensure that that ceasefire held, and that would stay in place on the front line at the Suez Canal in this case, with the parties, the Egyptians and the Israelis and the Brits and the French, separated, withdrawn, and then allow for a political settlement to take place. And that is really the essence of traditional UN peacekeeping. The Blue Beret is all about creating the space, the buffer zone, that would allow the political players who had been in conflict to take a deep breath, to take some time, and then to negotiate a solution without giving away the store up front, without having a sense that somehow they were, in agreeing to a ceasefire, not being able to get territory back or not being able to have the control that they were hoping to have. So I think the Blue Beret definitely was invented in 1956, and the concept of traditional peacekeeping was invented in 1956. The idea was not invented in 1986. What my grandfather's ability, with all those contacts that he had, all those relationships he had, was to promote that idea. In the end, it's quite interesting. After the Suez Crisis was over, Anthony Eden, for example, the Prime Minister, not long, but the Prime Minister of the UK at the time, a number of others all took credit for the creation of the United Nations Emergency Force. And if my grandfather was alive today, or I mean certainly was the case at that time, he was happy to give them credit. But the difference was that he promoted the idea. He got everyone to think that it was, there's the old adage that a good idea is never a good idea until you convince someone else that it's a good idea. Well, he convinced everybody else that it was a good idea, and then that's how we got UNEF.
So let me ask you about some of the criticisms of the Pearson approach. In the previous government, in the last decade, the government talked about the Canadian approach to international affairs as being, we just wanted to go along just to get along. It's sort of a view that we can't always be honest brokers. We should take a stronger stand in issues like that. What's your view of that criticism of the Pearsonian vision, but also the Canadian approach?
Well, let me deal with this concept of honest broker as a way to answer that question, Andrew. I don't think that my grandfather thought the term honest broker was actually an accurate reflection of what he did and what his diplomacy was about. The honest broker implies that you are a third-party mediator with no interest on either side, and the only purpose of being there is to try to facilitate some kind of resolution. We were a NATO ally. We were, in every aspect of what we did it as a NATO ally, as clearly part of the West. So any conflict, whether it was Suez or something else where there was an East-West schism, Suez was also a West-West schism, but the Soviets were threatening to get involved, and Egypt was their client state, so-called client state at the time. So this idea that somehow Canada played this neutral role, we were never neutral. We were always a committed member of the alliance, but at the same time, we recognized that in being a committed member of the alliance, we had the ability, close proximity to the United States, we had the ear of Washington, we had the ear of others, we had the respect of many of these countries. We were able to parlay our influence, or perceived influence in some cases, on big players like Washington into a role that allowed us to help find solutions to complex international problems. Now, some people define that as an honest broker. I personally don't. I think that is, in fact, a country which was able to use its unique advantages to advance the cause of international peace and security. So when the argument came that we would just go along to get along, I think that misunderstood our history. And misunderstood the fact that we were never doing it as a party that had no interest in the outcome or didn't care who, quote unquote, won or anything like that. We cared, of course we cared. We cared about preserving democratic values and interests, et cetera. But we were able to do it without the ego, if you want to call it that, without the sense that somehow, either on the one hand, we had to stamp our feet and look like we were important, but at the same time, had this ability to be trusted by other players. And I think that was going along to get along. It was in fact figuring out how the other side thought about things. My grandfather was often, and described it himself as, always good at seeing both sides. In fact, he once joked that, I have the ability to kind of see 6 or 7 different sides, which caused problems, particularly in his political career. But in diplomacy, that's what works. You're able to understand the other side and how the other side thinks. And Suez was in large part because the Egyptians, through NATO and others, et cetera, understood that my grandfather was trying to understand, was trying to recognize their point of view and incorporate their interests in finding a solution. And that's not going along to get along. That is understanding how the other side thinks, so that you can, in fact, find a solution that meets their interests, not just your interests.
So I would guess you don't see Pearson as being naive, that he understood that there were all these players out in the world, some that you liked and didn't like, but you still had to get on with them.
I don't think anyone that went through 2 wars, world wars like he did, that went through the kinds of challenges that he faced as a soldier, as a diplomat, as a politician, would ever think that somehow they were naive or that they didn't understand what the way of the world was. He understood the way of the world, and the point was that for him it was notwithstanding these tensions and divisions that exist, we can still make progress. I mean, that was one reason why he was the first NATO foreign minister to visit Moscow in 1955. I mean, he caught a lot of criticism for doing that. Was that going along to get along? No, that was actually demonstrating that, we're a committed ally, and I'm not going to Moscow because I'm somehow some third-party stooge or some way that I'm equivocating between the United States and the Soviet Union, but I'm there actually to say I'm willing to talk to you. I'm willing to have a conversation with you, which was something that Washington respected. I mean, Washington liked that kind of role that we were able to play, to find that kind of mechanism, back channel, whatever you want to call it, that allowed information, intelligence, and negotiating ideas to go back and forth. My grandfather understood that instinctively, and I think that is what is important in Canadian diplomacy is our continued ability to be trusted and respected by all sides. Yes, I suppose some people would say because we don't have an axe to grind, but more importantly because we know how to find solutions.
Yeah, and is that the essence of the Pearsonian vision or approach?
I think so. I mean, every concept, Pearsonian internationalism being one of them, needs to modernize. I mean, what worked in 1956 isn't necessarily what works today in the complex international community that we have. But what does work, what is, I think, always going to be important, is two things. Trust, being trusted by others, and also being able to demonstrate, and that's how you get the trust, that you recognize how interests are different, and that you're able to manage or find outcomes, solutions that are in significant part a recognition of those differences and the ability to bring them together.
Okay, I just want to close out with talking about today, bring you 60 years forward now to the present day. The federal government has announced its new approach to peacekeeping. What are your thoughts about that policy and what Canada can and should be doing in the present world?
Well, let me start answering that by going back to Suez and the United Nations Emergency Force. The Canadian peacekeeping force at the outset there was actually not, in the classic sense as people understand it, boots on the ground. Yes, we had Canadian peacekeepers in the Sinai at Suez in 1956. But their key role was logistics support. Administrative logistics support, making sure that the people got, I mean, we had a commander, Canadian Yale and Burns was the commander of UNEF, and he played a very important role, but the rest of the Canadian role, or forces, or peacekeepers who were there, were playing that kind of logistical, administrative support role, essential to any success for a peacekeeping operation. So what the government announced recently is actually quite similar in the idea of trying to develop the capacity, improve the capacity of the United Nations to be able to, in a modern context where, unlike, it's often not a ceasefire you're trying to manage or to help support, it's in the middle of a conflict zone. You know, that the peacekeeping in the modern era, that seems to be that. How do you interpose yourself right in the middle of a conflict and still try to create some kind of space for solutions? And administrative, so-called logistical training, that kind of thing, and the focus on women in peacekeeping, the gender focus and so on, it's all part of the 2017 version of that idea. Does this mean that we can't ever have more classical boots on the ground as we did in operations like Cyprus and elsewhere, and we did it under different auspices, like in Bosnia we did it under NATO. In Afghanistan it was a NATO operation too, but there was some UN role in that as well. Yes, we can still do that, but we need to go in with eyes open. I mean, and that's, I think the essence of that decision was to say we have various steps to take here. If we want to put, in a more classic sense, boots on the ground again, we should be thinking about making sure that, like I think as often can be said, what's your exit? What's your end game? What's your exit strategy and anything like that? Afghanistan, we lost a lot of soldiers in something that held up a temporary, a conflict that kind of went low level for many years. In Somalia, we had an even worse outcome. In Cyprus, and UNEF actually, in Sinai in the Middle East, we ended up being more than peacekeepers there for a temporary time. We ended up being in Egypt for 10 years. We ended up being in Cyprus for over 40 years. In fact, we still have a couple of players, some few players there. That's not what peacekeeping should be. Peacekeeping is not sort of put forces in and then sit around for 40 years waiting for people to figure it out. It has to be more innovative, creative in that. And what the government announced, I think, is sort of inconsistent with that thinking. As the years go on, I think it's important for Canadians to be asking them, so what else can you do? Beyond that, is there more that Canada can do? Because that is important about the experience of Suez, is that we have this reputation, and we have, not just in the international community, but in our own minds as a public, as Canadians, that Canada can be a difference maker in international affairs, can be a difference maker in issues like UN peacekeeping, and the question is, how can we do that in a way that's consistent with and recognizes the 2017 reality as opposed to what the reality was in 1956?
Well, we'll end there. There's so much to talk about, and this has been quite fascinating. Thank you very much. I was talking with Michaeal Pearson, the grandson of Lester B. Pearson, today on the occasion of the 60th anniversary of Pearson receiving the Nobel Peace Prize.